Motorcycle Adventures podcast, your hub for everything off-road, dual sport, and adventure motorcycles. My name is John. I will be your host. This is episode number 22, Ben Motorcycle Adventures podcast. Thank you for joining, and as always, thank you for listening. Episode number 22 tonight, and we're going to talk KTM 790 Adventure R specs. Again, KTM 790 Adventure R specs. BenMotorcycleAdventures.com. That is our website. You need to go there, check out our blog, catch up on all the latest podcasts, written content, off-road, dual sport, and adventure motorcycle tours in Oregon and all around the West Coast. BenMotorcycleAdventures.com. Don't forget to check out our website. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, not so much on Facebook, but if you follow me on Instagram, you know that I am obsessed with the KTM 790 Adventure R. I'm going to get this bike, very excited about it. I have a deposit down. I'm expecting delivery in May. I'm on a list, if you will, and I've heard a lot of speculation about when these models will be available. We're hearing May. I've heard things along the lines of, dealers may get one or two in May, the others may be pushed out till October. I hope that is not the case. I'd really like to take delivery of mine in May. But yeah, I'm going to get a KTM 790 Adventure R, and I thought it might be good to talk some of the specifications here on the podcast. So I think the bulk of the specifications have been made available since November when this bike was really released, if you will, formally released. So the specs really aren't a mystery, if you will. And this week or last week, KTM also announced the pricing for these models, which I talked about on the previous podcast. But your Adventure R model is going to be $13,499, and the I guess the lesser of the two models, the Adventure, will be $12,499 retail. Now that I believe that the Adventure model just doesn't have rally mode, and the WP Explorer suspension will not be adjustable on that model. So it's kind of more of a street model, if you will, but looking at the bike, more than capable off-road too. But I'm going to get the 790 Adventure R. So we know what the pricing is. Some of us know what the specs are, so I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the 790 specs. But something else that I did that I thought might be interesting is I compared specifications of this model up against some of KTM's other popular dual sport and adventure models. So I stacked it up against the 500, the 690, which has been revised for 2019, the 1090, and that big behemoth, that brute, the 1290, which, man, always looks so good, but that is quite the package. So what I did here is I really graded all these models in terms of price, weight, horsepower, power to weight ratio, fuel capacity, suspension travel, front and rear, and then in ground clearance. I don't know if I want to say ground clearance isn't important to me, but I've never ridden a bike where it was really an issue, but it might be a factor for some, along with seat height, which I didn't throw in there. But again, I just kind of threw that into the equation and said, hey, you know what? Ground clearance, more ground clearance is probably better, especially if you're riding some technical rocky stuff. So what I did is I just created a scale and rated all these bikes in terms of all these categories, and I did come out with a definitive winner, if you will. Now, I wouldn't say this type of information specifications should be the thing that steers you towards one bike or the other, because if I bought let me rewind here. I've never bought a motorcycle based on specs or shootouts or written content or anything like that. I think what's most important to me is I've got to be attracted to the bike first and foremost. It's got to be something that intrigues me, something that I want to ride and kind of learn and discover more about. And the 790 definitely checks that box for me. But again, man, there's a plethora of bikes you can get out there and adventure or dual sport on and have a really great time. So this is by no means a definitive list of which bike is best or a scoring scale or anything like that. But I think moving forward, I'd like to start to stack some of these dual sport and adventure bikes up against one another, kind of looking at these same specs. Little caveat, finding specs for all these bikes, as simple as it sounds, easier said than done. Every publication, if you will, every press release, everybody's got something different. So I could be off a little bit here or there, but it doesn't really change any of the overall data, but just wanted to throw that out there for you. So let's start by talking about some of the most notable KTM 790 Adventure R specs. Obviously, this thing is a twin. It's a 4-stroke, kind of a no-brainer there, but 799 cc's, 95 horsepower. That's beefy with 65 foot-pounds of torque. It's a 6-speed. What else? We've got about 9.5 inches of travel, front and rear. The tires, the wheels, if you will, are 18 and 21, which is really appealing to me, and most of the adventure bikes are, but that just gives you, in my opinion, a more diverse lineup or tire selection, if you will. So I'm happy to see they stuck with that. Claimed dry weight, 417 pounds. Sounds like a lot. It is a lot. This bike isn't, it's lighter than, your 1090s, your 1290s, some of your BMWs and Triumphs and bikes like that. It's also a little bit down in terms of horsepower and cc's, but 417 pounds is what the claimed weight is. When we get ours, one of the first things I'm going to do is ride it to a scale and try to get an accurate measurement of the weight. Fuel capacity at 5.3 gallons, I think that's pretty good. I'm confident there's going to be aftermarket tanks built for this bike, but I think 5.3 gallons for me, that's going to check the box. I'm not going to replace the tank. I could probably get somewhere, 200 to 250 miles with that much gas, maybe a little bit more. Just depends how I'm riding, what kind of terrain I'm riding in, but probably going to stick with that. And if I need a little bit more mileage, I'll carry something like one of the giant loose. Man, I am tongue-tied today. I'll probably carry something like one of the giant loop gas bags, which I've had good success with since they've released those. That's a really good a way to carry gas, safe way to carry gas. If you haven't tried or took a look at the giant loop gas bags, you might want to do that. Last thing here, service intervals over 9,000 miles now. I wanted to rate all these bikes based on service intervals, but I'm not really sure what they're talking about in respect to service intervals. Is that oil changes? Is that valve checking and adjustments? I have no idea what quote-unquote service intervals really mean, so I'm going to have to look into that. And I've talked about this before too. I'm not particularly hung up on service interval being a selling point to me. Most of these bikes you can change the oil on at least pretty easy. Routine maintenance, that's something that's not negotiable with me, and you should be always checking out your bike. And then some of those other things like valve adjustments and whatnot, they've just got to be done in due time. I mean, that's just part of owning a bike, and this is obviously a bike that I will probably own for a number of years unless it's just horrible. So I don't put a lot of stock in service intervals, so I kind of left that out of the equation. But again, that's kind of a broad overview of the KTM 790 or KTM 790 Adventure R specs. And again, 5.3 gallon tank. It's coming in around 420 pounds, and it's got plenty of horsepower. In my opinion, I'm sure it's gonna move the scale when you want to move the scale, and when you want to get out on the slab in the open road, you're going to have plenty of muscle, to run with traffic. Again, we talked about pricing. When I stack this up against other models in the pricing arena, KTM 500 comes in at the lowest, obviously, at $11,199. KTM 690 a little bit more, up there at $11,699. Then falls your KTM 790 at $3,499. The KTM 1090 just under 15 grand, and then your 1290 over 18 grand. Now that's the Super Adventure R or whatever model, but that one's pretty steep. So that one obviously scored the lowest in terms of pricing. Weight wise, KTM 500, no brainer here. That's the lightest, coming in around 240. Number 2, the 690. Again, these things just kind of fall like dominoes initially, and you can anticipate or expect that the 1290 is the heaviest model. I've seen a lot of different numbers for the 1290, but I settled on 478 pounds dry. Not sure about that. Horsepower, we've already talked about the 790 quite a bit. The KTM 500, the numbers I'm seeing are 62. I don't believe that is true in stock trim. You can put a different exhaust and a Vortex ECU on it. You'll most definitely push that thing to over 60 horse. I've done that to my 2018 model. Made some mods to that. In stock trim, it's probably under 50. But shoot, I mean, in stock trim, I've had my 2017 up around 100 miles an hour. So I don't know how much horsepower is a factor to you or how much it means. It doesn't mean anything to me. And in fact, it can be detrimental to rideability at times, but that's kind of how it stacks up. 690's got a little more beef and so on and so forth. You know, again, displacement all the way up to 160 horse on the 1290. Again, that is it's like a muscle car of adventure motorcycles. But when we break this stuff down, to claimed horsepower versus weight ratios, the 1290s actually ends up getting the highest score at about 0.33. 1090 follows, then 690. I'm sorry. Let me revise this. So if you look at your power to weight ratios, you've got the 1290, the 1090, the 500, followed by the 690 and the 790. So actually, the KTM 790 Adventure R ranks the lowest in terms of power to weight ratio. Now, again, I don't know if that's a factor for you. Not a huge factor to me. A lot of, when I'm talking about power, I'm really thinking about delivery. I like a good linear power from bottom to top, so I don't get too hung up on horsepower. And again, I think too much can be detrimental to the ride. And then on the flip side of that, probably too little, depending on how much luggage you have or how big you are. But there's, some of these smaller 250cc dual sports or 200cc dual sports, people are out riding all over the world on these things, and they've got 18 to 25 horse. So I don't know how much stock we want to put in that. Up to fuel capacity, your 1090s and 1290, they've got the largest gas tank. 790 coming in there just over 5 gallons. Then your 690 at 3.6. I think that's updated for 2019. I think you've got a little more fuel capacity. And then the 500, always scratching my head on this dual sport thing. 2.25 gallons. A little bit frustrating for me when I buy these bikes that basically they've got a little bit more than a motocross gas tank in terms of fuel capacity, but I always add the Acerbis 4-gallon tank to my dual sports, and that kind of remedies the problem. Maybe one of these future 500 builds, we'll look at trying that 5-gallon tank that basically it's a tank and a shrouds all in one. We'll see, but I've had really good luck with the 4-gallon tank, and then again, if I need to stretch it out well over 200 miles, there's a giant loop gas bag in the garage ready to go. Suspension travel front and rear, I think, as you can expect, the KTM 500 is quite a bit racier than the other models. It's meant to cross over, the dual sport and off-road arena, so it's going to reign supreme there. And then just based on displacement, that's kind of how the dominoes fall, front and rear, 690, 790, and then your 1090s and your 1290s. And I will say the 790 has quite a bit more travel than the larger adventure bikes, but nothing really stacks up here. Nothing stacks up to the 500 here in this arena, and you could really say the same. This is what you would expect for ground clearance. 500's got the most, and then basically the heavier the bike, the less travel it has, the less ground clearance it has along the way. And if I had a huge adventure bike, I don't know that I'd want a ton of ground clearance. I mean, you'd want to be able to touch the ground, but the higher you get that weight up, the harder the bike is to handle. Ultimately becomes top heavy. So you want that center of gravity as low as possible. So that's kind of how it stacks up. When we factor all these things together and these rankings together, KTM 500 scored 30 out of a possible 2, 4, 6, 8 out of possible 40. The 690 was second with 26 points. The 1090 and 1290 tied with 23 points. And believe it or not, even though I'm totally pro KTM 790 Adventure R, it came in last in terms of these specs with 22 points. Now again, I already talked about this in the podcast. Do with this information what you will. Again, I've never bought a bike based on a shootout, which I love to read those things in Cycle News and MXA and Racer X and whatever, but I've really never let any of those things influence my decision too much. But that's just saying, the tail of the tape here. Here's kind of how I see the bikes ranking, and outside looking in, before I started to kind of crunch the numbers and look at the specs, I probably would have said this is how it's going to break down. I mean, the 500's cheaper, it's lighter, and I think KTM wants that to be the most versatile bike in the world, and there's definitely a lot of evidence to that when you factor some of these things into the equation, especially the weight and just kind of the versatility. Off-road, dual sport, adventure, it doesn't really matter. That's a bike that can be ridden anywhere, but so are all these other bikes. But again, I can't help but recall episode 21 and Aaron Steinman and the 500 that he's ridden all over the world, weighted down with luggage, camping off the bike, 60,000 plus miles on it already. That's definitely a testament to that bike, and I hope to enjoy that kind of longevity with the 790. So all of that kind of parlays into my question of the week. I want some feedback on this from you guys, so email me, benmotorcycleadventures@gmail.com, or hit me up with a response on Instagram. You can DM me, or even shoot me a messenger on Facebook, and that's at Ben Motorcycle Adventures, Facebook and Instagram. But knowing what you know, what bike would you buy in 2019 for your off-road or dual sport adventures? Again, benmotorcycleadventures@gmail.com. Which one of these bikes or other bikes would you choose for your adventures in 2019? Now, just my 2 cents on each of these models here for a couple minutes. Obviously, I have a couple KTM 500s. I think collectively I've got about 13,000 miles on the two. So I've spent plenty of time talking about the versatility of that machine, from single track trails, to the open backcountry roads, backcountry discovery routes. I wouldn't blink an eye about riding this thing all around the world. I mean, again, Aaron Steinman and a host of others have ridden these things all over the place. So I think it is truly a very versatile bike, and I've definitely tested that, at least locally in here in Idaho. So that's a bike that I'm quite fond of. I think I'll always have one in the garage, but it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And if you do, a fair amount of adventure riding, that there are transitions there that include slab, pavement, whatever you want to call it. And the 500 obviously isn't really at home out there. A fair amount of vibration, which, there's other factors in that equation. How round you've managed to keep your wheels, what knobbies you choose, what kind of stuff you've got hanging off the bike, but obviously not at home. I remember I recall that ride off the Magruder corridor all the way to the Lolo motorway in Idaho was pretty much pavement, predominantly pavement. Probably not the longest stretch of slab I've ridden, but one that I recall so much because it was still beautiful. But the 500 just really wasn't at home out there, and I found myself searching out back roads and staying off that highway that runs through Montana because, just to run with traffic, I don't really feel at home on the 500. That being said, KTM isn't building this bike so that you're comfortable out on the pavement. It truly is a dual-purpose bike that's meant to tackle, some of the toughest off-road situations, but have the ability to cross over into the adventure bike arena, which, I think they've done well. Now, if your, adventure riding includes those long sections of slab that I've talked about, or short ones, or, just riding through national parks, I think the KTM 690 is a great bike. It's one that I looked at really hard before getting my first 500 in January of 2017, I believe it was. I think that bike is set up and outfitted, from the factory to be a really great bike that has the power plant to make you comfortable on the pavement for those sections that none of us really want to ride, but sometimes we do. But the endless back roads, the dirt roads, the cinder and gravel roads around here locally, I think the 690's pretty awesome, pretty well rounded for that stuff. I don't think it's as good on the trail. Why? Because it's 300 and some pounds and it's got a lot more power. I'm sure there's guys that do trail ride them and they're going to tell you they're the best thing since sliced bread. But, reality is, weight and horsepower, those are significant factors once the trail or the road shrinks down significantly. So that wouldn't be my choice for that. I think the 500 does that better. But I think for true adventure bike riding or backcountry discovery route riding, or if you're going to ride the Dalton in Alaska or whatever, I think the 690 is pretty darn tough to beat. Now, as far as the 790 goes, I really am seeing that as a tweener, something that bridges the gap between the 690 and the larger twins, the 1090 and the 1290. For me, that's going to be a true ADV bike, fully set up with the modern conveniences and luggage and things like that, and it's going to carry me along backcountry discovery routes and Continental Divide and places like that. I'm not going to take it quote unquote off-road, not going to ride trails or just the type of technical stuff that we have here in Oregon. It's gonna be out on dirt roads and gravel roads and things like that. That's how I see that bike. It's gonna be more of a 5-star resort for me. Walea, Maui. That's what I'm thinking with this bike. So I'm hoping that's where it fills the gap for me. That being said, I'm confident I could do the same things on the 690, and I've done the same things on the 500. So this could be a vanity purchase, more of a want than a need for me. But again, that's always a large factor for me when I'm talking about purchasing a new bike. It's something that I've got to want and something that I've really got to be interested in. And at least here in 2019, or what is it, 2019? Yeah, that's the bike that I'm looking at. Now the 1090, I looked at it hard last year. Almost bought one in March and ended up with a 2018 KTM 450 XCF. Now those two bikes are universes apart, but as I've set up the 350s and 500s we have here for kind of dual sport, I didn't have a dedicated off-road bike, and there's a lot of great off-road riding here in Oregon and Central Oregon, and I still want that out of a machine, and I don't want to put a bunch of unnecessary wear and tear on the dual sports, especially the ones that I rent. So I went that direction and didn't go with the 1090. But I've spent plenty of time researching that machine, and I'm definitely interested in it. I think the 1290 is just too big for me now. I don't want to go on those types of rides, and I don't plan to carry lots of luggage, at least right now. I think I can travel pretty light. So the 1290 is really out of the equation for me right now. But we'll see how the 790 performs, and we'll see how it does, kind of up against how I envision the bike, and then we'll move appropriately from there. But right now, out in front of all this, I'm planning on having that 790 for quite some time. So I think that's just about going to do it for this episode of the Ben Motorcycle Adventures podcast. I want to thank you for listening and hearing me compare and contrast some of these KTM 790 Adventure R specs. It was really interesting little process for me stacking the 790 up against the 500 all the way to the 1290. If you think I should stack the 790 or other models up against other OEMs or other popular dual sport or adventure bikes, shoot me an email, benmotorcycleadventures@gmail.com, and I'll get to work on that. Again, these are just specifications. There could be a 500-pound bike out there with 3 inches of ground clearance and 5 inches of suspension travel that I totally love to ride adventure. I don't know. But again, these are just specs. At the end of the day, you're the one riding the bike. You're the one that has to make that decision, what works for you. And I just base a lot of things, again, on my interest in the bike and the look and the appeal of the bike. And then it's imagination. Where can I go and what can I do on the bike? And obviously, I think for most of the things that I want to do, any of these bikes fit the bill. And there's a lot of other bikes out there that fit the bill too. Don't forget about our website, benmotorcycleadventures.com. I'm going to include a fairly detailed blog post with this particular episode, so you might want to read that if you prefer to read as opposed to listen. And then, as always, at Ben Motorcycle Adventures on Facebook and Instagram. Lost my train of thought there for a second, but yeah, at Ben Motorcycle Adventures on social media. Check us out, give us a follow, and always love to hear the feedback and comments. So we'll catch you next time on episode number 23 of the Ben Motorcycle Adventures podcast. Again, I thank you for listening.